and gentlemen, welcome to the preliminary round 6 of the 29th World Schools Debating Championship in Bali, Indonesia. My name is Aya and I will be the chairperson of this debate, while Landing here will be the timekeeper. In this debate, each speaker will have 8 minutes to make their speech. After 1 minute, the timekeeper will signal once like this. After this, the debaters of the other team may offer points of information to the speaker. Debaters must stand up when they offer points of information. The speaker who has the floor may choose to accept or decline a point when it is offered. At 7 minutes, the timekeeper will again signal once. After this, no more points of information may be offered for the rest of the speech. At 8 minutes, the timekeeper will make a double signal like this. After this, the speaker must conclude within a few seconds. There will be a short break at the end of each speech for the judges to complete their notes. After the state's main speeches, each team will have the opportunity to make a 4-minute reply speech. This can be made by either the first or second speaker of each team. No points of information are allowed during reply speeches. The opposition will make the reply speech first. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. Before the debate begins, I would like to remind you to switch off all mobile phones and anything else which might disturb the debaters. Should you need to leave or re-enter the room for any reason during the debate, please wait until the end of the speech to do so. Audience members should be aware that they may not participate in the main debate. There will be an opportunity to make comments after the judges have left the room at the end of the debate. I would now like to introduce the judges for this debate. They are Manos Kalakens as the chair, Aurora Sarah, and Michelin Groundland, and Wanda Gibson as the trainee.
Who's absent?
Should we proceed?
Yeah, we should get sick.
In proposition for this debate, we have Team United States of America. As the first speaker, Sarah Lanier. And the second speaker is Aditya Aryadar. The third speaker is Colette Faulkner. The reply speech will be delivered by Aditya Aryadar. For Team Opposition, we have Team Uganda. As Mahruk Sajid as the first speaker, Luyombo Abbas as the second speaker, Musinguji Kabila Dennis as the third speaker. The reply speech will be delivered by Luyombo Abbas.
I think we're fine.
The motion for this debate is, this House believes that when working to preserve rare and endangered species, private entities are more effective than the state. It gives me a great pleasure to invite the first speaker for the proposition team to open the debate.
In the last century, the accelerating pace of human development has poisoned the environment, forcing thousands of species into extinction. But to protect thousands more that are currently threatened with the same fate, we on Side Proposition believe that organizations that put their interest first best serve their needs. And because of that, we are proud to propose the motion. This House believes that when working to protect rare and endangered species, private entities are more effective than the state. So with that, a few things in this speech. First, 3 clarifications that need to be made, then presenting our first 2 substantive arguments that are on first, that the government's interests are not aligned with preservation, but second, that the government has a lack of resources to be truly effective. while our second speaker will present our third argument. But first, 3 clarifications that we need to make very clear in today's debate. The first is that in the context of this motion, a private entity has a primary goal to preserve the environment and its species. However, we also think that species ranges far past just animals, but can go to any wildlife as a whole. For example, plants, meaning we on side proposition in today's debate want to advocate for protecting the environment. But second clarification is, what does preservation actually look like? Well, we think it looks like 4 things. First, habitat preservation, meaning ensuring these individual areas of wildlife have a proper habitat. But second, decreasing waste through things like cleaning up the ocean or the beach or their general habitat. Third, through academic research to fund environmental aid. And fourth, by increasing public awareness. We think these are all things that private entities can tackle better than the government, which we will explain in our first 2 substantives and our third. But the third clarification we want to make is on the burden of side opposition in today's debate. We think they need to show you why the state is the uniquely best actor and why they would have both this incentive and ability to preserve wildlife. So with that, our first substantive argument is that the government's interests are not aligned with preservation. The first layer under this argument is that the government's priorities are misaligned. To look to this individual layer, we will look to the 3 priorities that governments have. The first is to their citizens. Governments were formed to protect their citizens. That is their original purpose. However, we think that when it comes down to protecting a citizen's life and protecting the environment, the government will choose protecting the citizen first. We think that a prime example to look to is within Brazil, where the Brazilian government constantly supports the logging industry that is tearing down the Amazon to the point where it is currently 90% torn down. This is an instance where the government of Brazil is trying to further economic development over environmental development with the justification of protecting their citizens. But the second governmental priority we believe is misaligned is that the government is often short-term focused. We think that the government is comprised of elected officials. These officials whose constant goal is to ensure they can get elected into office once again. That means they are constantly targeting short-term benefits so they can show them to the people that vote so they will see that they are being a proper elected official. However, we unfortunately think this often means they are prioritizing short-term goals over long-term environmental protection. This means things like the impact of decreased biodiversity are long-term impacts that these politicians don't always have to look to because they can't use it as a success story when they want to win the next election. A prime example we want to present on side proposition is with phytoplankton. We think this individual group is going extinct, and the government is constantly contributing to pollution in the dumping of waste that is causing this very extinction. However, these are very vital, especially for the lives of what fish eat. We think that they serve We think that they serve a vital purpose in preserving the lives of individuals, but unfortunately, it's not a government's main purpose. But the third reason we think that government's interests are not aligned with preservation is because they often don't have the same international focus when it comes to a private entity. We think that oftentimes countries don't like to try to reach out to foreign entities in other countries to try to have conservation efforts abroad. For example, you're probably not going to see the United States going over to Russia to try to protect their winter foxes. That's just really not probable. However, we think that private entities have a unique example to try and help. Unfortunately, we don't see individual groups like the United States trying to help when it comes to the example of China. No, thank you. For example, China is currently building trash heap islands in the South China Sea, not only to try to get rid of their waste, but to try to claim more land. This is horrible for their environment, but you don't see countries like the United States targeting this issue specifically. However, with that, our second layer under this argument is why private entities prioritize this type of protection. The first reason is because of their original purpose. These private entities don't have an obligation for citizens inherently, but for the environment. It is why they were crafted in the first place, meaning they are reliable to try to help the environment. That means their purpose is for environmental protection, meaning their interests are already more aligned. But second is because they don't have a political agenda. These people are constantly trying to help the environment. That is why they're even elected on the boards of these organizations in the first place, meaning they want to continue trying to help environmental policy. But the third reason is because they often are more internationally focused and have this international access. We think that groups like the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace often do international missions to try to help preserve wildlife internationally, and that is what makes it the most beneficial. But with that, our second substantive argument, I'll take you in a second, is on the government's lack of resources to be truly effective. But before I go on, I'll take a point.
Speaker, do you believe the fact that private enterprises, as they develop the environment, the first motive is the profits they get from the work they do?
We think that private entities, in the terms of environmental focus, have a profit incentive to give this profit to the environment. We think when they try to gain profit, it is to help the environment. That is why we think they are better equipped to do so, which goes into our second substantive argument on their ability to be effective. First layer under this argument is that governments have resource trade-offs. First, the government doesn't have an unlimited fund of resources, right? Like governments don't have as much money as they want. We think that all of their priorities that we showed you in the first point for a government come before environmental protection. But second, even if these governments try to prioritize environmental protection, they often don't have a lot of money left over from any other policies that they have tried to fund. This is especially true in countries that are experiencing economic hardship. You can look to the example of a nation like Greece. Greece has a debt of 175% of their annual GDP growth, meaning we don't think they have a lot of funds left over to try to help the environment. You can also look to countries that are prioritizing military development. We think nations like South Korea that have recently been building missile defense system are not only extremely expensive, but often bad for the environment. They often choose education and healthcare over the environment. Unfortunately, these resource-strapped nations, even if they do try to help the environment, often pass weak laws to do so. They often don't go through and try to enforce the laws that actually they have passed in the first place because they don't really need to. A prime example is with the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. We see that fracking is still extremely probable within multiple nations globally, but especially within the United States, and often this act is disregarded. But our second layer under this argument is that private entities solve this problem. The first reason is resources. Resources are donated to these private entities, like we have listed out, to protect the environment. That is why they are getting funding, and this is a direct answer to the POI I was asked. They get this funding to help with the environment. But second is with their incentive. They are incentivized to draw in more funding so they can give it to the environment. They have a unique incentive that the government doesn't have to try to bring in more profit, not only to increase awareness, but to try to increase funding. But third, because they do not have a trade-off system. Their main priority is with the environment. But the fourth reason this is true is because it is extremely effective. We think that these individual entities are better able to invest in individual technology investment to try to help the environment and resource investment as a whole, meaning it is ultimately more effective for them to try to increase any type of protection for these species as a whole. So ultimately in today's debate, we have shown you not only why governments are ill-equipped to try to preserve any wildlife necessary within the status quo, but why private entities can do so in a better way and why they are more incentivized. So for these reasons, we are proud to propose.
First speaker of propositions, 8 minutes and 20 seconds. 8 minutes and 20 seconds. To open the case from team opposition, we call upon the first speaker of team opposition.
Okay.
Now, if you think you've led and no one has followed you, you've simply taken a walk. Result. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me back to the motion. This House believes that when working to preserve rare and endangered species, private entities are more effective than the state. I'm the opposition. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's motion has two spices. One, as team opposition, we shall prove to you the ineffectiveness of these private entities when it comes to preserving the rare and the endangered species. Two, we shall show you how effective the state is when it comes to preserving the rare and endangered species. Ladies and gentlemen, the question of tonight's debate is not who has much and who does not have much. The question is, how effective are you in terms of doing a particular thing? That brings me back to the motion. The first speaker from the proposition keeps on insisting on the fact that the government does not have the interest because its priority is on the health and education. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me back to the question of the government holding the authority, of which we as team opposition believe. Ladies and gentlemen, they also question furthermore to the resources that the government is having insufficiently. That brings me back to the point of actually alarming these people that no, look here, the point is that private entities, by you advocating and telling us that they are actually focused more on protecting them, we insist as team opposition that the fundings they claim to have sufficiently are derived from the profits they attain.
Point.
That implies that in case the profits are not turning back, what happens? These preservative measures are shut down. That closes her argument in a moment. She keeps on insisting about the ways of which the private entities are actually trying to preserve. One, they talk about the decreasing in the ways of dumping waste. They also talk about the academic research. They talk about the public awareness. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not about the ways they're trying to adopt. Tonight's debate is for the affirmative burden, the proposition's burden is to show how these particular ways that they're claiming to have been in place are effective when it comes to preserving. She failed to do that. And it's on that point that we as team opposition, we question the private entities. One, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, these private entities have insufficient resources. We are going to question the financial stand of these private entities. One, these private entities are actually running upon the profits that they attain. What does that imply? The implication is that once profits stop to come in, that means all these strategies they have adopted to actually protect the environment, they close down. Second, we question about the effectiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, it's actually unaffordable for these private entities to keep on preserving, of which they have failed to prove. Now, tonight's debate requires Tonight's debate requires team proposition to take the burden of proof to show us of the so-called and so-claimed ways in which ways are they effective. They failed to do that. Now, moving on, ladies and gentlemen, we also want to prove to you that indeed these private entities are profit-oriented. There's a lot of profit repatriation. That brings me back to the case study that was carried out in Africa. Based on the study of Morocco, Madagascar, and Algeria. It clearly identified that these people, which are private entities, did not have enough money, and people from other countries, North America, like USA, actually came, and the Mexicans came in Africa and based their entities and invested. Now, what did that mean? They did not aim at actually protecting the environment and benefiting the people they were living with, but instead repatriating the profits they got. That brings us back to the point that how effective are these states when it comes to preserving the environment. Now, we are looking at the interest of the nation, not at the interest of the individuals as they're claiming as private entities. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, she kept on questioning that the prioritization of the government. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me back to the point that the government has the authority to pass laws, of which contradicts her argument when she keeps on complaining of the government's ability to preserve. I hope that answers her. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the point of logic is not driven home. When she kept on insisting that the primary goal of the private entity is to advocate for the environmental protection. Two things. She failed to prove us how is it effective when it came to preserving these endangered species. Second thing, even if it's the primary goal of the entity, it's not achieved yet fully. And it's on top of that that makes us feel that it is still ineffective no matter the goal and prioritization. Now, looking at our case, now we as a team opposition, we believe it's not rather the private entities, but instead the state, which is more effective when it comes to preserving the rare and endangered species. And it's on that I will take a point.
How is the government of Greece supposed to prioritize or even protect the environment when it's having to deal with an economic crisis across the entire nation?
Be clear, I beg your pardon?
So how is the government of Greece going to have the funds to prioritize the environment if it has to focus on building up its economic crisis?
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings me back to why we still insist the government is more effective. Listen carefully. Now, I want to talk about the resources that the government is already having sufficiently. 1, in terms of labor. 2, in terms of money stand. 3, in terms of the financial capacity. 4th, of which I'll have the argument as it shall be broadened by my second speaker, of why we still insist to show you these arguments try to prove to you that indeed it's the state which is more effective when it comes to the preservation of the rare and endangered species. Questioning the resources. 1, the government has already enough resources like the financial stand. I'll hint on the financial stand, where the government is already having money to actually implement the variety of strategies when it comes to preservation, which contradicts with the first argument she tried to bring in as the core theme of their case, which brings about the resources that these political entities have the primary goal to protect. Now that's why they have the resources. Ladies and gentlemen, with the state having enough resources to fund the strategies to preserve, is better than these profit entities which are on a probability scale. That if profits come in, that's when they will drive the thing. If they don't come in, they fall. So which one do you choose? This one. Now, ladies and gentlemen, state does not rely on profits. That's one. And that is our stand part of tonight's debate. That, now ladies and gentlemen, all this is showing you how ineffective the private entities are when it comes to protecting and preserving the rare and endangered species. Ladies and gentlemen, bringing back to her case, she kept on insisting, dear ladies and gentlemen, that there shall be academic research as she claims. We want to question people who over the years have been knowing how to protect these rare and endangered species. But how effective has it been when it comes to the protection? It does not come out in an effective way to show us that however much the public is aware of this protection of the rare and endangered species, how effective is it when it comes to the preservation? We've seen very many posters around, we've seen very many political entities upcoming and bringing very many social media advertisement. But what effect does it have? Zero. But when it comes to the government has the authority to actually pass laws. And it is upon those laws which dictate the environmental protection. And it is upon these laws that actually can be extending the penalties to those who break the laws. What guarantee do they have that in case certain strategies they are claiming to work are going to be effective? Which brings me back to our point. Which brings me actually to the repetition of tonight's debate that this House believes that when working to preserve rare and endangered species, private entities are more effective than the state. Whereas team proposition tonight came out to just really dictate to us of what they think the strategies are in place, but they failed to show us the thing that the first speaker failed to effectively show us and carry out the burden of proof signifies that the whole team has lost tonight's debate. Because if they fail to prove to us onto why they still insist on believing the private entities are more effective when it comes to the preservation of the rare species, we are ready to take tonight's debate.
Yeah.
So if they want to burn like sun, they will first have to shine like you. Resolved.
First speaker of opposition team spent 8 minutes and 12 seconds. 8 minutes and 12 seconds.
To continue the case for peace opposition, we call on the second speaker of the
What comes out of the opposition is a very compelling narrative about why governments have the authority to pass laws and the financial standing to actually carry out effective environmental policies. The problem that comes out of opposition is largely the same problem that they try to characterize us with. Being said, opposition can show you why government has the authority to pass laws, but they never once told you why any of those laws were effective. Instead, they failed to engage with the analysis that we brought you in Proposition 1, which is not only that governments have interest in not passing effective laws, but even when they do pass laws, they are often ineffective, often passive, and instead, private entities are forced to do the bulk of the work on environmental conservation. Two questions of rebuttal. First, whether states have interests and whether private entities have competing interests. And second, on whether they're actually able to affect conservation policy. But before that, a quick clarification on your stance. What do we think these private entities actually look like? When the motion says, when working to preserve rare and endangered species, we don't think we're talking about like corporations like ExxonMobil. That's never what we've stood for in this round. So when opposition asks Sarah a point of information, aren't these organizations motivated by profits? We'd say almost exclusively never. Instead, we think these are overwhelmingly non-profit organizations, like the World Wildlife Fund, like the Sierra Club. Instead, the revenue that they get is largely from donations, which are funneled into conservation. Largely, that's the first argument that opposition tries to come to you with in today's debate. When they tell you that private organizations are motivated off of profits, we don't think that's true. So, let's look at the 2 points of rebuttal in this round. We think the first point is whether private entities or state entities have bigger interest in protecting the environment. First, why is this question such an important one? We tell you that at the point where private entities have a higher incentive to invest in environmental conservation, they are more likely to create effective policy. If government or if opposition can't show you that governments have an interest in creating effective policy, obviously they're not going to be the more effective actor in this round. That takes us to the point about interest. What do we tell you? We gave you 3 different reasons why government's interests aren't actually aligned with environmental conservation. First, because their highest priority is their citizens and their well-being. Second, because they're largely short-term thinkers, so they don't take into account the long-term consequences of conservation. And third, because they're not global actors. We'd also tell you that especially when you have corporate interests that are able to lobby these governments, for example, what we see is the cattle industry heavily lobbies the government of Chile, the government will never regulate it. So the government has no incentive to actually effectively conserve these sort of, effectively conserve rare and endangered species. Instead, what do we think that private organizations have an incentive? First, we tell you there's no obligation to the citizens. The obligation first and foremost is to the environment. That's the reason they get donations in the first place. The World Wildlife Fund can't not help wildlife and still think that they're getting donations. But second, we also tell you that there is no political agenda. At that point, we think that wildlife agencies aren't motivated by who comes next, by what citizens actually want. Instead, they're far more able to think about the long-term consequences of protecting the environment. And third, they're far more global actors. They're the only ones that can actually reach out to other countries and ensure that you see conservation efforts occurring globally. That's why we think that private interests or private entities are far more interested in conservation and creating effective policy than the state. That takes us to the second question. Does the state have the ability to do so? We pose this burden at the top of Proposition 1 when we said that the opposition needs to prove that the state has the ability to meet this kind of effective policy. Why so? Because if you don't have the ability to kind of create effective policy, obviously your policy isn't actually going to be effective. So why is the state not an effective actor? Why does it not use its resources properly? First, we would say all government policy, simply put, is about trade-offs. At that point, states have to consider their actions. Is it going to be funding education, or is it going to be funding environmental conservation? At that point, we think states are almost always inclined to put these conservation efforts on a back burner. But second, we tell you that because they don't have funding, and we give you reasons why, we tell you states are far more likely to involve, or states that are involved in economic hardship are not going to be able to do this. But even so, we see the broad majority of states are still less likely to fund environmental conservation efforts. What's the alternative? They resort to passive laws. Laws that are not actually enforced. So we see in the United States, you have laws that theoretically protect environment, but instead you have the fracking industry literally running all over the environment. The laws do absolutely nothing to solve that. Whether or not opposition comes to you with a question of the government being the highest authority that can create laws is irrelevant at the point that the state doesn't effectively create laws. So what did opposition one come to you with in this round? They told you that private funding was ineffective, right? Because it was motivated off of profits. That's not true, but let's actually show you why the points that we mentioned are so effective. First, we told you about habitat preservation. That's literally related to preserving rare and endangered species. When private organizations are more able to do this, we think they fulfill the burden in this motion. Yes?
So do you consider the fact that the basic source of these private entities is the profits that they gain?
No, it's the donations that they gain. We tell you, overwhelmingly, the World Wildlife Fund is funded by people donating to it, and I'll talk exactly about why that worsens under your side of the house. But second, we tell you that you decrease waste. Private conservation agencies almost always take environmental cleanup efforts, doing things that the state never does. At that point, we think it makes the habitats more safe. We think they're able to better preserve rare and endangered species. Private organizations are indeed effective. Their points here are that the government has the authority to pass laws and that the government has the financial standing. Again, we would tell you, at the point where the government passing laws doesn't mean they're actually effective laws, we think we need to hear a far more compelling account out of opposition why exactly the government passing laws somehow makes them effective, something that we've never seen in the past. Now it comes to our third argument, that state action turns popular sentiment against conservation. When the state takes on wildlife conservation, it inherently becomes seen as a political issue. We think this is dangerous for the conservation movement. But why is this policy seen as a political issue? Especially because we think in the status quo, environmental policies are perceived as especially leftist. When we think the state adopts these kind of policies, what it does is it intrinsically ties environmental conservation to one party or another. Why is this problematic? First, because people that oppose the political party that are in charge are far more likely to distort the narrative of conservation and use it against the party. And second, because corporations that have a vested interest against conservation efforts use or give money to these groups, giving them massive power. What does this actually look like? It looks like the coal industry in the United States, where you have sensible environmental regulations being perceived as a war on coal. And we think this directly increased political opposition to the Democratic Party in the United States. Why is this problematic for efficacy under their side of the house? First, it decreases state efficacy in the short term, at the point where states are less likely to pursue environmental regulations because they fear getting voted out of office. Second, it decreases state efficacy in the long term, at the point where governments that do pursue environmental regulations are voted off of office. They're often replaced with governments that don't pursue environmental regulations at all. So you don't have effective conservation policies in the long term. But the third point here is that we think it creates backlash against conservation agencies because now they become politicized, tied by association to one political party or the other. We think what you do is you increase increase sentiment against those conservation agencies, but you also decrease the amount of donations for conservation and preservation. We see this as uniquely important because donations is largely how these organizations function. At the end of the round, what have we brought to you with today? We tell you on side proposition that you stand for private organizations that have the actual interest and the ability to actually fund effective conservation policies. The state has neither.
Second speaker of proposition spent 8 minutes and 19 seconds. 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
To continue the case, the team opposition will call upon the second speaker of team opposition.
Thank you. Tonight's debate is closely answered by two questions, which are a point of clash between proposition and opposition. Whether private entities are effective or not effective, and whether the state is effective or not effective. And if we answer these questions rightly, we take the debate. First of all, they say that state entities, the state lacks resources. Good, the state lacks resources. At the same time, they say private entities have resources because they receive resources from funds from donations. The question comes, if funds are coming from donations, what if these donations reduce? What will happen? Will these entities stand? That's the question they can't answer. Two, by the fact that these are private, let them not limit the understanding of the debate. Private, some of them can be profit-oriented. And if they are profit-oriented, it means they will get profits from what they invest in the environment. And if they get from what they invest, what if the investment reduces? I mean, what if the outcome reduces? Will they realize their profits? And if they don't realize their profits, how will they continue in operation? This makes their point null and void. Furthermore, they extend the argument that for government, the interests are the interests of the citizens are the primary ones, not preserving the environment. Now, judges, I have this question that they have to answer us. Is that people who vote this government into power, the citizens, are there some of them who support protection of the environment like they do? And if they are there, it means, do you think the government can it work? Is it that part of the interest of its citizens? If it's part of the interest of its citizens, it means the government has the duty to do that because it is the interest of the citizens who brought it into power. No one says that the people who vote the government want health, want education, want economic growth, they don't need preservation of the environment. It is those people who elect the government where some of them need protection of the environment, and so the government must work on them. But even if they were correct, dear judges, you have to note the fact that as private entities come to protect the environment, who helps them to secure the right to protect? It is the government. So if it is the government that helps them to protect, this government which is in power must make sure that the ideas you are going to do are within the interests of the citizens. So if it's within the interest of the citizens, that's when they can give you the power to do it. If they deny you the power to do it, will you do it? So it means it's still under the power of the government, which dictates that this is in line with our interests and of which we are serving citizens. So since their interests are like this, then we should give them this private entity chance to deal with it. And so that's why we think their point of saying the government interests are for citizens, it is completely wrong because citizens are also interested in the protection of the environment, and that's why the government can do it effectively. Furthermore, the debate extends on the fact that on the issue of the resources, they say government lacks resources. They say government can issue laws, but laws are ineffective. Now, judges, this is the issue. When you are dealing with endangered species, they need protection and preservation. Protection deals with security. Who deals with the security or coercive apparatuses that can help protect these animals? This is the state. So you need the state, one, to protect these animals. Two, because the state has funds. The state has alternative sources of funds. Instead of one person who is depending on donations only, and if donations decline, it means the state will be affected. A case in point, imagine there is a private company dealing with wildlife in Zimbabwe, where they have cut off donations to Zimbabwe. So what will happen to that company? If it's not a duty of the state, but the state still has the capacity to deal with these animals and protect them. The state has all the resources, financial, security, coercive resources, which at the end of it all can protect. And that's why you see, we still have these animals because the state is protecting them. She comes across and she says, but look here, sometimes the state has difficult economic challenges, like she gave an example of Greece. But the challenge is here, that these private companies, some of them that are owned, are to take care of these companies, of this wildlife. If are profit-oriented, the state has to get tax, to pay back the debts. So it means they have to tax these private companies which are dealing with this wildlife protection. So at the end of it all, they are also affected. So what are you dealing with? Still, you are bringing back the duty to the state, and that's why we are saying the state is better because the state is accountable to the people. If I vote you in power and I want you to protect white rhinos, if you don't do it, I have the right to remove you from power. Next time you'll be held accountable. But when you deal with someone whom no one will go and question what has happened, it is of challenge to the state, and that's why we are seeing they are not more effective, the private entities. Furthermore, team proposition had the burden to prove to us that the ways they bring up of public awareness of what is the proof there that the government can't do them, so it's only the private entity which can do them effectively. If they can't prove that, it means what they are suggesting, government has the capacity to do it better than the private entities, and so we believe private entities stand a better. Yes, I have a question.
Why does the government of Brazil have more incentive to protect the Amazon when they've funded its 90% deforestation?
Why the government? Pardon?
Why does the government of Brazil have more incentive to preserve the Amazon when they have funded its deforestation?
The government has the interest to protect. That's one factor you have agreed the factor. The citizens, they have interest in those animals. And if they are willing to have them protected, they are protecting them because it is the mandate, the government gets the mandate from the citizens. And if the citizens' interest is to have this protected, of which that is your interest equally you people. So if the government should bring in power, the interest you have sent it for, they have to do it, unless you don't want it. But if you want it, they're going to do it. And then the private person, how will you account to him when you brought this government in power? The government should be answerable to the state, unlike the private people who will be answerable to no one. And we are extending our argument on the fact that they say that government plans might be short-term. But the problem is, even if they are short-term as they claim, it means there is accountability. If you come back after 5 years, we shall ask you, please, we told you to protect our right to our white rhinos. Did you protect them? Will you tell us that I gave the task to a private person? It means you have failed our work. So the state has the capacity, because one, private enterprises don't have security. State has the security apparatus which protects. First of all, the state has resources, alternative resources, but the private enterprises which depend, one, on the profits. If they fail to come out, they won't work. Two, on donations, and in areas where donations are cut off, the countries will remain suffering. Studies have shown that across the Sahara Desert, and East Africa, where the white rhinos are, in areas like Namibia, where they have given chance to private enterprises to take care of wildlife, the poaching rate has increased because of the fact that when in case the workers we are dealing with, you pay them unfairly, the quality of work will be affected because they realize, since the boss is not paying us, let me sell off the rhinos, the white rhino, let me do something that I get more money, this is not paying me well. But the state, one, has paid these people well, and they're taking care of these things. So the state has a stronger capacity to deal with these people and make sure that the environment is protected, make sure that the endangered species are preserved and protected because they need protection, which the state can be effective. So a task team proposition to prove that the ways they are bringing up of public awareness of what the state can't sensitize, which owns media. Can you imagine? A state has even a media house, has newspapers which they can use to sensitize people. So what proof is there to show that the state is not effective and therefore it can't do this? So private entities have much more power to help the state to perform its task, and the state can't go with, and the state is not in position to go with all its people. They say that the state concentrates on the political agenda. But the political agenda consists of education, health, consists of the environment. So if all these things are part of the political agenda, the government which wants to come to power, it will come back and do all that work. So all that can prove that the private entities are more effective than the state. However, team opposition tonight has the capacity to win the debate because of the fact that they have proved that, one, the state has resources. Reason, alternative funding. 2, they have security apparatuses. 3, they have the capacity to set up laws and supervise. However, yet on the other hand, we have shown clearly that since the private companies, as they say, depend on donations, we want them to discuss the issue on the fact that donations are cut off, what will happen? And in case not donations, if profits do not come out, what will happen? The work will be affected. So at night, we believe opposition stands a chance to win the debate because of the fact that we have shown that the state has more power to deal with things, and we should account for the state, not to private people, so that we get a better environment. Thank you. I rest my case.
Second speaker of opposition team spent 8 minutes and 19 seconds. 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
To continue the case for case of proposition, we call upon the third speaker of case opposition.
Okay.
There are two things we told them that they needed to prove in this debate today. First, they need to show you why the state has the direct incentive, the interest to prioritize things like the wildlife and the environment over its trade-offs and over its direct and most important obligations to its citizens. But second, they also show you how the state have the means to be effective not in the short term, but also in the long term as well. We think at the point where they actually haven't engaged with the analysis we brought about trade-offs, about the state's obligation and interest, we don't think they've won the first burden today. But second, when it comes to our last burden we've placed on them, at the point where they don't show you how the state is truly going to be successful in the long run, even with regime change, we don't think they've met any of the burdens we've placed on them today. So, two questions in this speech. First, which is it, governments or private entities, are actually going to have their interests aligned with truly helping the environment and preserving wildlife? But second, which is going to be more effective? So going on to the first question on interests being aligned. What we tell you is that currently our governments right now, and historically in the past, simply haven't been interested with prioritizing preservation of the environment and of wildlife. They try to tell you, well, no, this actually isn't true. We see that private entities are profit-driven and aren't really interested, but simply interested in the profits, something we'll address later. And so they try to tell you, because states aren't really profit-driven, that they're going to be the better actor when it comes to serving these interests. We think, first of all, that's not actually true. Maybe governments aren't literally profit-driven, but what we see is that one of their main interests and objectives is to increase economic growth. At the point where many politicians and citizens alike see that environmental regulations usually harm economic growth, governments tend to prioritize increasing economic growth over implementing regulations that would better serve the environment. But second of all, what we tell you is that government's biggest obligations is to its citizens. That's why when there's ever any type of case or any type of conflict between, propping up the environment or propping up the interests of its citizens, they're always going to side with their citizens because those are the people that give them the power to be there in the first place. But thirdly, we tell you that governments often only usually look at short-term goals because of things of having term limits, of having to win the next election, which is why even if there supposedly is any type of laws or regulations being passed to protect the environment, we usually see they don't go hard enough, they don't usually look at the long run of things. But at the worst case scenario, we see none of those things actually happen. The government still continue to prioritize short-term things, such as the government of Brazil, just like completely chopping down the rainforest and being okay with that for the sake of, propping up their economy. But fourthly, what we also tell you about why governments don't have the right interests or incentives is because they're not internationally focused. They're not willing to look at how the environment's affected, not just in their domestic borders, but also how it's affected around the globe. We think those were 5 key responses that we've laid on team opposition, but quite frankly, haven't been given engagement or any response has been brought up on their side. But second, why do we tell you private entities are going to be better when it comes to having their interests correctly aligned with preserving the environment and preserving wildlife? Well, we tell you their main purpose is literally to do so at the point where their obligations aren't tied to citizens, aren't tied to how people vote for them. We think they're always going to choose to prop up the environment than to look at further interests, which is why they don't have political agendas, and which is why they're more willing to be globally focused, and thirdly, why they're more willing to enact policies and do things that are actually going to be hardline and protect the environment. We think that this is important. No, thank you. We think that this is important because the reason why we went on this is they haven't correctly shown you why the state would even have the interest or the incentive in the first place to be able to prioritize the environment over its many other obligations when it comes to what they do. But second, going to our next question, which is which side do we think is going to be more effective? They try to tell you on their side, when it comes to the government, it's going to be more effective at the point where governments can pass laws. We say, okay, we would support that governments should take action to, help the environment, but quite frankly, we don't think that's simply enough, and we don't think governments are the best actor to do so. Why? It's because we tell you often the laws they pass are passive and reactive, such as laws that really just focus on recycling, but laws that don't actually focus on preventing dangerous measures that harm the environment. But second, when we say, even if these laws are passed, even if the laws are so great like they tell you, we often see that they're simply not enforced because doing so would take time and take money on the side of the government, which is why in the United States, when we see laws like the Clean Air and Water Act saying that certain industries can't pollute above this level, we still see that industry, specifically the fracking industry, still pour toxins into the air and into the water that not only affect wildlife, but affect people at all. But what do we hear coming from governments that implement these types of things? We don't see any type of regulation, we don't see any type of oversight, meaning that effectively these laws are rendered useless at the point where our governments aren't willing to enforce them in the first place. But thirdly, no thank you, but thirdly what we would also tell you is that these laws can just simply be easily overturned with the instance of lobbying, where you have certain interests who heavily lobby the government and the government's more willing to listen to them. But second of all, we tell you that governments often change, such as in the case with America, where we have Trump that wants to defund the Environmental Protection Agency. But thirdly, like the D2 tells you in our third argument, often what happens when governments choose to implement environmental regulations, people then see it as a politicized move, as governments intervening in places that they don't want to, and then seek out politicians specifically that are going to be against any type of environmental regulation, electing these people into power, making it just that easier to destroy the environment and not to protect them. And that's why we don't think that laws are simply enough on their side. And why do we think this is important? At the point they haven't engaged with any of the analysis we are here, we think we win on the matter that even at their highest ground, if laws are passed, they're simply not going to work and they're not going to be effective on their side.
Information?
Yes, go ahead.
Having said the fact that government might work to increase on the economic standards, if a government realizes tourism and protecting these animals is going to improve the economy, can they do it effectively since it's the source of funding?
So what we see is that we understand that governments do try to help the environment, but we think in the status quo is governments only look at things short term. Maybe having some type of regulation might help long term when it comes to the economy, but the point where it harms economies in the short term, they're always going to make sure they try to protect those, which is why they choose not to pass laws that would create any type of harm to the economy in the short term. So going to the second thing of why we don't think governments are effective, what we tell you is the trade-offs. The question, like they try to tell you, isn't about profits running out. Instead, it's about which side has trade-offs that need to be concerned with. We say the points where governments oftentimes struggles with funds, such as trying to fund healthcare, trying to fund education. A lot of countries simply do not have the means to be able to prioritize, send all of their funds to prioritizing the environment, which is why we tell you that private entities are going to be so much better. Because one, they don't have the obligation to, prop up the entire economy or prop up every single citizen in the country. Instead, their main purpose is simply focused on what they can do when it comes to the environment here. That's why we see that when they have lots of funds, even if these funds were supposedly to run out, which we don't think is true because of the amount of donations they're given, we see that private entities do the most effective things because they can use all of their funds to build up technology that goes up to clearing trash out of the oceans, or doing things like having the money to be able to buy land for preservations to protect habitats. We think that's what's going to happen to private entities. when all of their funds can be simply focused on one thing of protecting the environment, while governments have to choose between trade-offs, have to choose between funding fundamental things like education or healthcare, or between funding things like protecting the environment. So, what do we see when the round comes to close? We think they haven't proved to you why the state is going to even have the incentive or the interest to put the environment first over its obligations to its citizens. But second, we don't think they've actually proved to you how the state has been effective historically and how it would be effective now. We think on our side, we think that private entities are going to be much more effective at the point where their only purpose is to serve the environment. Thank you.
The Speaker of the Opposition team spent 8 minutes and 19 seconds. 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
To continue the case of team opposition, we call upon the third speaker of team opposition.
Protocol officer, I salute you all. Tonight, we have so many questions that the team position has failed to answer as we come to the end of the motion. Number one, they are bringing up a very strong, or they are arguing very strongly about the plans or the effect of the government may be short-term. But they have not shown us in any way how what they are saying will be long-term. So up to now, we believe that all the methods that they have given us do not indicate their long-termness. Further on, I would like to show the corruption that have been in tonight's debate. Number one, it was about the lack of resources. And they were saying that government lacks resources. But to our argument, our main argument, we brought upon many arguments. For example, security. We asked them who provides the security to these species that we want to protect. It's the government's resource. So we believe that they need the government to protect the resources that they want to protect. Without the government, they cannot protect the resources, or they cannot preserve the resources that they want. Further on, we brought about the argument of finance. And we asked them a very main question tonight, a question that they have failed to understand and to answer. In a case they fell out of finances, in case the organizations which are supporting the organizations do not get enough finances, what will they do? Up to now, they have not answered that. Further on, we caution them that they are saying they will get the profits. After getting the profits, they will invest these profits into protecting these species. We are asking the team preposition, in case you do not get those profits, where will you run to? That will be the government. That indicates and shows that government has enough resources to protect, and government has enough resources to protect. To protect these species. Further on, we raised a very key question tonight that up to the end of tonight's motion, they have not answered this question. The question that can they prove that the methods which they want to use cannot be effected by the government? They have failed. We have given them examples that we as the government, we have the media to eradicate. We have the schools to bring about the academic research that they want. We can bring the public resource, the public awareness. Up now they have failed prove to us that the government is not in position to do or to use the methods that they want to talk about. Further on, the biggest crash here tonight was about interest. As they come trying to convince this house that the government is more interested into the citizens' work and winning the election. And we question them one thing. If the citizens, as they have said, government may be interested in them. If the citizens are environmentalists, that means that the government, all the politicians will work in the interest of protecting these species. So as when the next election comes, they can win the election. For that matter, therefore, we believe with you, with your support, the government, all the politicians can work in the interest and can promote the interest of protecting these species. Further on, they brought up a very controversial point about pollution. And they left us wondering that these industries, for example, 98% of the industries which are owned in East Africa are owned by the private sector. They say that these industries release waste materials which go and destroy the species. At the end of the day, these locust house we all know that most of these industries are owned by the private sector. And this same private sector is the one that they are advocating to, that will give the species which they are failed to protect by releasing the waste materials from their industries. Further on, they said we do not have the ability, we do not have the international cooperation to promote the interests of protecting this. I'm asking one question. Don't they know that platforms that the government has, UN, AU, for example, in 2010, one of the main agendas that the government talked about during the UN meeting was about protecting the environment. So to us, as team opposition, we believe that the government has more international platforms, more international bases, more international grounds where they can come up to present issues that can promote the environment, unlike the private sector. Thank you.
Is the government going to be more interested in saving a certain endangered species or propping up its education system?
Thank you. We believe that it will be interested in more taking up the species because the environments or because the people who voted them into power have that interest. We believe that if the people have that interest and if people advocate for them to promote it, then at the end of the day, they will promote it so as to be voted back into power. Further on, there is still a very question that up to now, the end of this motion has not been answered. We believe we as team opposition, they have not showed us how the private sector that they are supporting is more effective, or what measures it has, or how it stands a better chance to protect this species, unlike the government.
Who is more effective at trying to preserve the South China Sea? The government of China, who is literally funding islands of pollution, or organizations that are trying to stop this?
Thank you so much. We believe that the organization they are talking about cannot operate without the support of the government. They need us, the government, to operate. If those organizations form themselves in China, all they need is the government to be in China. Further on, they talk about a very strong issue that they seem to have won this debate, but after analyzation, we stand a better chance to win this debate. The issue of short-term goals, that governments are aiming at short-term goals, but at the same time, they brought about controversy in their own case when they say, but although the government needs short-term goals, they need to win the election. So, which politician needs to win the election who maintains on short-term goals? We as the opposition, we believe that if the politicians that you are saying, they mind on goals, they will want long-term goals which they will benefit from in the future. For that matter, therefore, with all those brushes being cut down, I believe that team opposition wins tonight's debate. I rest my case.
Yeah.
The Speaker of Opposition will spend 6 minutes and 5 seconds. 6 minutes and 5 seconds.
To conclude the case from team opposition, we call on the reply speaker of team opposition.
Thank you. Tonight's debate has been zeroed down to mainly almost 4 areas of contention, of which we think tonight team opposition must win the debate. First of all, what about the issue of effectiveness? Is the state effective or public or private entities will be effective? And it extends the issue of ways. If the private entities are effective as they claim, they brought up means which they believe private entities would use to become more effective. However, the shocking bit was that when we tasked them to prove whether the state can't do all this, they realized the state is already doing it and the state can do it effectively. So they needed to go an extra mile to show the House tonight how private entities can do something extraordinary than what the state is doing, which they failed to point out. So they failed to point out that, and we have shown them how the state has the power even to do it more. it means we win the debate. Because we gave them examples of media which the state has to sensitize. International platforms, we showed them, and that will prove their ideas of cooperation, of sensitization, of getting awareness completely wrong, and academic research, because we showed them the state still has all those capacities to do them. So they had to show us which extra mile proves that private entities can do that, and we have shown them that actually they learn that extra mile, yet the state has it, and tonight opposition wins that debate. Second of all, it was an issue of interest. What is the interest? What is the primary interest of the state? They say the primary interest of the state is its own citizens. We say, since primary interest of the state is its own citizens, citizens are interested in the environment as they are part of the state now. We are interested in the environment. And if they're interested in the environment, since the interest of the state is its citizens, the interest of the citizen is environment. So which proof do they have that the state is going to follow the interest of education and health, but it's going to abandon the interest of environment, which is part of the interest of the citizens who vote them into power? They could not answer such a question. And the failure to answer such a question proves that they know that since it's part of the interest, the state is willing to do that. The fact that the state can gazette, the fact that the state is already doing means to make sure that these endangered species are protected, the fact that they can go to UN and discuss all these issues, it means it knows these are interests of our people and we need to protect them. Furthermore, the debate proceeded on the very interest about political agenda, but still linking to interest. They said they are short-term goals because they are aiming at winning elections. But the question is to the judges, if someone is aiming at winning elections, do you do something which people don't like or what they like? You do what they like. If you do what they like, if their interest environment is part of it, won't you get out for the environment? If you have to get out for the environment, that's how you're going to win the election, and it proves their point wrong. However, but even if their point was correct, the fact that they don't show us how private entities are going to do long-term things still shows they are not effective because of the fact that they're not showing the long-term plans they have, but they're dealing with what the state can do, even what can do better than the private entities. Furthermore, the debate extended on the resources and donation. They say private entities have more resources. Reason because they have donations, reason because they have cooperation. The question comes that what if donations are cut short for cases like Zimbabwe, cases like where the government is not in good connections with some countries like US which are funding and funds are cut down? What will happen to the private entities? What will the state proceed? They can't answer that. We tell them, look here, the state has alternative means. They can get enemies and still they make this sector go on. And that one, if they fail to answer it, means they know that the state still has more capacities because the source of funding of these private entities is only donation. But even if it was not only donation, it was profits, we told them what if the sector is not performing well? Will they invest more when their profits are not coming back? They could not answer such a question. And that proves tonight that team opposition wins the debate. Furthermore, the argument extended to the fact that the states aim at economic advancement. The question was, if they aim at economic advancement and they know endangered species bring tourists, who will increase the funding of the country and more money? Then what stops the state from concentrating on that? If the aim is economic development, and this is where the economy is, then the state must do more on that. And the fact that the state has more capacities to do that, it means it will do it. Resources furthermore say that they debate because the fact was, who has resources? We told them these animals need protection, which is security. We told them, they talked about the fact that laws are inefficient. But if laws are inefficient and you're not going to give security, you're not showing us how private entities are going to make laws efficient and how they're going to change everything. The fact that they can't prove the extra mile private entities can go, and you can prove how the states have proved efficient and they're going to be more efficient, it proves that the team opposition wins the debate and the government has no plan. That's why it's transferring its responsibility to private entities so that it's not accountable. Thank you. The rest of the case.
Reply Speaker of Opposition Team spent 4 minutes and 24 seconds. 4 minutes and 24 seconds.
To conclude the debate, we call upon the reply speaker of the proposition.
Two things in this speech. First, the strategic error that comes out of the opposition bench, and then the two framing questions. First, which side, private or state, has better interests? And second, which side has better resources? We think both of those questions are critical to determining effective policy. But first, the strategic error that comes out of opposition bench is that they don't engage with the third argument we give them when we tell you that state action turns popular sentiment against conservation by politicizing narratives. Why was this so important? First, because it decreases state efficacy in the short term when governments don't choose to pursue action because they fear being voted out of office. But second, because it decreases state efficacy in the long term because now you have governments that don't actually want to preserve the environment. Especially when Opposition 3 spent 4 minutes talking about the long term. We think the failure to engage with this aspect of our argument is especially hurtful for their side. But the third point we tell you is that you increase backlash against private entities that are now politicized, effectively undermining conservation efforts. We think it was a strategic error that loses them this round. But let's talk about the questions. First, are private or states entities better interested in preserving the environment? We told you in second that opposition had to show interests are aligned. Otherwise, it doesn't matter whether states have the ability to do so because they simply won't create effective policy. Why are the interests of states not aligned? First, because of the citizens. We see when the economic interests come into conflict, states almost always prefer those economic interests. We tell you about the Brazil logging industry, about the Chile cattle industry, about how both of those decrease the government's willingness to provide environmental regulations. Then we talk to you about short-term analysis. Government doesn't care about an abstract term like biodiversity or 1 or 2 endangered species dying. They care about another oil rig to get jobs for their voters. Third, we told you about lobbying at the point where corporations literally fuel anti-environmental campaigns. And fourth, we told you about global issues. They told you about governments cooperate on environmental issues. We think they cooperate on issues that affect them like pollution, but they don't cooperate on issues like conservation. The United States will never tell Russia, preserve your foxes, they're going extinct. Their only response to this argument was the idea that citizens vote for the government. They thought that was their best argument because they spent 2.5 minutes in reply on it. Why are 3 reasons why we don't think this actually occurs? First, lobbying distorts the balance of power, so you will always have governments staying in power fueled by corporate campaigns. But second, citizens are far more likely to vote for leaders that protect the economy. That's what Colette tells you, because they're far more likely to get jobs. They care more about getting jobs than 1 or 2 endangered species being saved. And third, we tell you that you increase the state with environmental policies when you tie it to political narratives. All of these things just fuel the state's inefficacy. On the other side, they never contest that private entities are aligned with environmental conservation. Given that, why do they have the resources to engage with this, right? So opposition's narrative here is that states have money, but private organizations don't. We give you 2 structural reasons that states misallocate resources. We're saying states don't have enough money. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that states are very likely to misallocate the resources at the point where they care more about trade-offs and they're far more likely to create passive laws. In opposition to their response to this is just, well, states collect taxes. Yes, but that still doesn't engage with the trade-off analysis that we give you. What is our narrative? That private organizations have resources because we say you get a lot of donations. Their response here is literally just, what happens if donations run out? First of all, that doesn't constitute sufficient engagement. They don't give you reasons why donations will run out. Second, we see they haven't in the past. The World Wildlife Fund is very well funded. But third, we think you actually run that risk on their side of the house because with state action, you politicize these environmental groups, so you decrease the amount of donations that we have. The new idea in opposition theory on this is that private organizations are somehow supported by states. We don't think this actually occurs because we tell you that state entities are not interested in supporting these private organizations. What do you have on these 2 sides of the house? You have a proposition that tells you that private organizations are better interested and better suited to responding to effective conservation policies. States simply never do that. That's why proposition takes the debate.